Before dawn on January 20th, 2011, while most of America was still asleep, over 700 federal agents fanned out simultaneously across New York, New Jersey, and Rhode Island. They hit apartments, restaurants, barbershops, and social clubs all at once. By the time the sun came up, 127 of the most dangerous organized crime figures in American history had been pulled out of their beds, slammed against walls, and thrown into handcuffs. All 5 of New York's most powerful crime families, the Genovese, Gambino, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno, were hit in a single morning. It was the largest coordinated Mafia takedown in American history. And it didn't happen overnight. It took the FBI nearly a century to get there. But here's the thing. For decades, the FBI didn't even officially admit the Mafia existed. J. Edgar Hoover, the most powerful law enforcement director in American history, spent years publicly insisting there was no such thing as organized crime in America. No conspiracy, no families, no empire, nothing. While the Mafia was quietly taking over entire cities, running gambling, extortion, murder for hire, and eventually billions of dollars worth of illegal operations. The man whose entire job was to stop them was telling the public it was all a myth. Whether Hoover was embarrassed, compromised, or simply in denial, history is still arguing about it. But the result was the same. The Mafia got a decades-long head start while the FBI looked the other way. That head start allowed men like Al Capone to build something that looked less like a criminal organization and more like a Fortune 500 company. Capone ran Chicago in the 1920s and early 1930s the way a CEO runs a corporation. Except his board meetings ended with people disappearing, and his quarterly reviews involved machine guns. At his peak, Capone's operation was pulling in an estimated $60 million a year, the equivalent of nearly $1 billion today. He owned judges, policemen, politicians, and entire city blocks. He didn't hide. He threw lavish parties, sat front row at boxing matches, and gave interviews to newspapers. Capone was so untouchable, he genuinely believed nobody could ever bring him down. And for a long time, he was right. Murder charges never stuck because witnesses had a mysterious habit of changing their stories or simply vanishing. Bootlegging charges fell apart. Assault charges evaporated. Every time prosecutors came close, the case somehow collapsed. Capone walked out of courtroom after courtroom smiling, straightening his tie, and waving at reporters like a man who had just won an election. But the FBI had one agent who refused to quit, Eliot Ness. And Ness had a team of investigators so carefully selected for their inability to be bribed that they became known as the Untouchables. Ness hit Capone's breweries, raided his operations, and systematically dismantled his bootlegging empire piece by piece. But even that wasn't enough to put Capone behind bars permanently. In the end, it wasn't bullets that brought down the most feared gangster in America. It wasn't murder charges, bootlegging, extortion, or the mountains of violent crimes Capone had committed over his career. It was taxes. The Internal Revenue Service discovered that despite earning tens of millions of dollars, Capone had never filed a single tax return. Not one. The man who had survived shootouts, assassination attempts, and a decade of federal investigations was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison for tax evasion in 1931. The most powerful gangster in American history. Brought down by an accountant! Capone entered Alcatraz, America's most brutal federal prison, where the celebrity lifestyle, the parties, the bodyguards, and the power evaporated completely. He spent his days in a cell like every other prisoner. By the time he was released, his mind had been devastated by syphilis and the brutal prison years. The man who had once owned Chicago died quietly at his Florida estate in 1947, confused, diminished, and completely forgotten by the empire he had built. But if Capone's takedown was satisfying, the next story was something else entirely. Because the FBI thought taking down Capone was hard. Then they met a man from Queens who beat them not once, not twice, but 3 times in a row. A man so slippery, so arrogant, and so genuinely convinced he was untouchable that the newspapers started calling him the Teflon Don. And for a while, that nickname was completely earned. John Gotti didn't become the boss of the Gambino crime family, the most powerful mafia family in America, by being subtle. He became boss by having his own boss, Paul Castellano, shot dead outside a Midtown Manhattan steakhouse in December 1985. Castellano was sitting in his car outside Sparks Steakhouse when gunmen walked up and executed him in front of dozens of witnesses on one of the busiest streets in New York. It was brazen, it was public, and it was exactly the kind of move that told every other crime family in America one thing: there was a new king in town. And Gotti played the role perfectly. He wore $2,000 custom-tailored suits. He held court in the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy like a medieval monarch receiving visitors. He was charming, charismatic, and genuinely loved by his neighborhood, throwing 4th of July fireworks parties for the entire community out of his own pocket. The press couldn't get enough of him. Photographers followed him everywhere. He smiled for every camera, straightened his tie after every arrest, and walked out of every courtroom like he was leaving a red carpet event. And the FBI came for him. Hard. They built case after case. Racketeering, murder, extortion. 3 separate times federal prosecutors sat across from juries convinced they had enough to put Gotti away forever. 3 separate times the jury came back with not guilty. The Teflon Don. Nothing stuck. It later emerged that Gotti's people had been bribing and intimidating jurors so effectively that the trials were compromised before they even began. One juror was found to have accepted $60,000 to vote not guilty. Another had been physically threatened. The FBI was building airtight cases, and Gotti was dismantling them from the inside out. But Gotti had one fatal flaw. He never stopped talking. He ran his mouth constantly, in his social club, at dinner, on the street. He discussed murders, ordered hits, and talked about FBI investigations with the casual confidence of a man who genuinely believed he could never be touched. What Gotti didn't know, what nobody told him, was that the FBI had planted listening devices inside the Ravenite Social Club. Every conversation, every order, every admission, all of it recorded. Hours and hours of Gotti's own voice describing his own crimes in his own words. When the FBI finally arrested Gotti in December 1990, this time it was different. This time the star witness was Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, Gotti's own underboss, the man who sat beside him at every meeting, carried out his orders, and knew every secret. Gravano had decided that going down with Gotti wasn't part of his plan. He flipped. He sat across from prosecutors and described 19 murders in clinical detail. Combined with the surveillance recordings, the case was bulletproof. In 1992, John Gotti was convicted on all counts: racketeering, murder, conspiracy, obstruction of justice. The judge sentenced him to life in prison with no possibility of parole. The man who had thrown neighborhood parties, preened for cameras, and beaten the FBI 3 times was let out of the courtroom in handcuffs. He died in a federal prison medical center in 2002, the Teflon finally gone, replaced by an orange jumpsuit. But if Gotti's downfall was dramatic, what happened next was somehow both terrifying and absolutely, completely ridiculous. Meet Vincent the Chin Gigante, boss of Genovese crime family, widely considered the most powerful and most dangerous crime family in America. While Gotti was grabbing headlines and posing for photographers, Gigante was doing the exact opposite. No cameras, no interviews, no $2,000 suits. Instead, Gigante spent nearly 30 years shuffling through the streets of Greenwich Village in a dirty bathrobe and slippers, mumbling incoherently to himself, looking like a confused old man who had wandered away from a hospital. It was all fake, every single second of it. Gigante had constructed one of the most elaborate and long-running deceptions in criminal history. The bathrobe, the mumbling, the apparent confusion. It was a carefully choreographed performance designed to convince law enforcement, prosecutors, and psychiatrists that he was mentally unfit to stand trial. And it worked for 3 decades! Every time investigators got close, doctors would examine Gigante, declare him mentally incompetent, and prosecutors would have no choice but to back off. The most powerful crime boss in America was protected, not by lawyers or bribes or intimidation, but by a bathrobe and a performance worthy of an Oscar. Inside the Genovese family, however, everyone knew exactly what was happening. Gigante ran his empire with cold, calculating precision. He held meetings in whispers. He communicated through hand signals and written notes that were immediately destroyed. He was so paranoid about FBI surveillance that members of his family were forbidden from ever saying his name out loud. They had to point at their chin to refer to him. The man pretending to be mentally ill was running the most sophisticated criminal organization in the country. But the FBI refused to let go. After years of building a case, they finally gathered enough evidence, including testimony from informants inside the family, to prove that Gigante's mental illness was completely fabricated. When prosecutors confronted him with the evidence in 1997, Gigante finally did something he had refused to do for 30 years. He dropped the act. He pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice charges and was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. The bathrobe got folded up, the shuffling stopped, and the man who had fooled America for 3 decades walked into prison standing completely straight, clear-eyed, sharp-minded, and looking absolutely nothing like the confused old man Greenwich Village thought they knew. He died in federal prison in 2005. The greatest performance in Mafia history. Ended behind bars. And while Capone, Gotti, and Gigante each fell in their own spectacular way, nothing the FBI had ever done before could compare to what they were quietly planning for the morning of January 20th, 2011. Because this time, the FBI wasn't going after one boss. They were going after all of them, simultaneously, in a single morning. Before anyone had a chance to run. At 5:30 in the morning on January 20th, 2011, over 700 federal agents from the FBI, DEA, and Secret Service moved simultaneously across 3 states. No warning, no leaks, no last-minute escapes. They hit apartments in Brooklyn, social clubs in Staten Island, restaurants in New Jersey, and barbershops in Rhode Island, all at exactly the same moment. By the time the sun fully rose over New York City, 127 members of organized crime had been arrested in a single morning. It was the largest coordinated mafia takedown in the history of the United States. The indictments covered everything: murder, extortion, drug trafficking, illegal gambling, and loan sharking. All 5 New York crime families were hit simultaneously: the Genovese, Gambino, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno families. The same organizations that had ruled American organized crime for nearly a century were all targeted on the same morning by the same operation. The New Jersey DeCavalcante family, the real-life inspiration behind The Sopranos, was also swept up in the same net. Decades of surveillance, hundreds of informants, thousands of hours of recorded conversations. All of it culminating in one morning before most of America had finished their first cup of coffee. And then came the names. When prosecutors read out the list of defendants in open court, something unexpected happened. The entire room started struggling to keep a straight face. Because while these men had spent decades building reputations as terrifying, untouchable organized crime figures, their nicknames told a completely different story. The indictments included men known as Tony Bagels, Vinny Car Wash, Johnny Pizza, Frankie Steele, Lumpy, Marbles, Hootie, Johnny Bandana, and, perhaps most magnificently of all, a man known simply as Jell-O. The most feared criminal organization in American history, taken down by men named after breakfast foods, car services, and desserts. But underneath the comedy of those nicknames was something genuinely historic. The 2011 raid didn't just arrest 127 people. It effectively shattered the operational structure of organized crime in America in a single morning. The bosses, underbosses, captains, and soldiers that had kept these families running for generations were gone simultaneously. There was nobody left to give orders, nobody left to collect debts, nobody left to run the machine. It was the moment the FBI had been building towards since Eliot Ness raided Al Capone's breweries in the 1920s. Since the Appalachian Meeting of 1957 forced America to finally admit the Mafia was real. Since the RICO Act of 1970 gave prosecutors the legal weapon they had always needed. Nearly a century of work paid off before breakfast on a cold January morning. These takedowns reveal something profound about the nature of power in America. Capone thought money made him untouchable. An accountant proved him wrong. Gotti thought charisma and fear made him untouchable. His own best friend proved him wrong. Gigante thought a bathrobe and a performance made him untouchable. 3 decades of patient FBI work proved him wrong. And the 5 families thought their century-old empire made them untouchable. 700 agents and 1 cold morning proved all of them wrong. Because in America, no empire, no matter how powerful, how feared, or how carefully protected, survives forever. The FBI just needed enough time, enough patience, and enough agents willing to show up before sunrise. And they always show up before sunrise. For more interesting videos, hit the subscribe button, and don't forget to like and share.